Yeah, welcome back for all of you. And this is another time I was given notes from one of Uganda students, and he wanted me to record sessions using English language only because I have some of the few sessions I taught before, but I used both two languages, Swahili and English. And no, some of you students from Uganda, you don't understand Swahili, so I will be facilitating these sessions using only English language in order to make you able to understand different concepts. So I received notes from Dr. Mbosa Science, who is the online teaching facilitator in Uganda. But I told that student that these notes I can't use them because they are very summarized and they don't have a lot of detail which we normally use them to answer different questions of exams. Actually, I don't have a Uganda syllabus, but Ugandan syllabus is mostly similar to that of Tanzania, and I would like to use the notes from Tanzania. So if you like to buy these notes, you can contact me, then I can give you way how you can get them. But otherwise, we can continue with the session, and I hope you will enjoy my session. So, firstly, that in this topic of gaseous exchange and respiration, here in Tanzania, we are always starting with gaseous exchange. So we are discussing regarding the gaseous exchange, and then later we'll go to discuss about the aspects of respiration. So we'll start our topic by discussing the concept of gaseous exchange, and then we'll move step to step until when we will end for today, and then we shall see how we can continue this for tomorrow. Now, gaseous exchange and respiration. First, we are starting with the introduction of gaseous exchange. As I said, gaseous exchange refers to the exchange of respiratory gases between the cells of organism and the environment. The exchange of respiratory gases. For human being, respiratory gases are not only for human being, for all living organisms, respiratory gases, mainly we are talking of the carbon dioxide and oxygen. Oxygen is used in the respiration, while carbon dioxide is the end product of respiration, is the gas which is produced after respiration or during the process of respiration. We are producing carbon dioxide as one among the product of breakdown of carbon compounds. So body or our body, they require oxygen, and they produce carbon dioxide during metabolism. In summary, metabolism is the total of all chemical reactions which are taking place in the cell. Within the cell, there are various categories of chemical reactions which are taking place, including respiration and other all categories of chemical reactions which are taking place within the cell. We call them together or collectively as metabolism. So the processes or metabolism, they tend to produce carbon dioxide as the waste product. Our bodies will need to take in oxygen for metabolism, and after metabolism we will produce carbon dioxide, which must be exchanged and should be moved out to the atmosphere. So gaseous exchange refers to the exchange of respiratory gases between the cells of the organism and the environment. Cells and the environment. Actually, not all living organisms, they are in contact. I mean, not all cells of all living organisms, they are in contact with the environment. Some of the living organisms, such as the flatworms, including the platyhelminthes, most of their cells, they are in direct contact with the environment. That's why they don't have the respiratory surfaces. But for a larger living organism, such as a human being, not all cells they are in contact with the environment. That's why there is the need of the special system. There is the need for the special system which can ensure the exchange of respiratory gases and which can ensure the circulation or the distribution of respiratory gases all over the body. So what we are saying that aerobic organism, they require oxygen for respiration. Rest both aerobic and both anaerobic and most aerobic organism must get rid of carbon dioxide and the waste product of respiration. So even an anaerobic organism, They don't do aerobic respiration, but they release carbon dioxide. The area where gaseous exchange with the environment actually takes place is called the respiratory surface, and every kind of living organism has its own respiratory surface. Gaseous exchange takes place in all organisms by the physical process of diffusion. Gaseous exchange inatokea kwa kitendo cha diffusion. It's by the process of diffusion. I'm sorry because I was mixing with Swahili and I've forgotten that I'm teaching Ugandan student who don't understand Swahili. But no problem. Gaseous exchange takes place by the physical process known as diffusion. I know some of you have the concept of diffusion from your ordinary biology or even chemistry. Diffusion is simply the movement of molecule from the region of the low concentration to the region of the high concentration. So, in order for this to occur effectively, the respiratory surface must have some adaptation, must have some characteristics or some properties. We will be asked about the characteristics or the adaptation or the properties of respiratory surfaces. We discussed these from the O-level biology, but again, we repeat are teaching these parts because they are sometimes asked in our exams. So now let's move to discuss about the characteristics of respiratory surfaces. First, it must be permeable so that gases can pass through. If it is impermeable, that means no gases they can pass through these respiratory surfaces. So it is permeable to allow the gases to pass through it. And second, it must be thin because the diffusion is efficient only over short distances of 1 millimeter or less. The respiratory surfaces, they are very thin in their diameters, or they are very thin in their thickness, allowing the gases to diffuse faster from one side of the respiratory surface to another side, which will be easier for the gases to be transported all over the body. Third, it should possess a large surface area so that sufficient sufficient here it's not environment, sufficient amount, here it is sufficient amount. So it should possess a large surface area so that sufficient amount of gases is able to be exchanged according to the organism need. Now, I would like you to pass through my cytology sessions in order for you to understand what the word large surface area to volume ratio simply mean. For most of people, they think that having large surface area, that means they must be large in size. But actually, the different surfaces of the body or different parts of the body, when they are small inside, that means they have large surface area to volume ratio. Even the cells, they always maintain their small size in order to maintain a large surface area to volume ratio, which can enable them to exchange different materials with the environment. So having large surface area to volume ratio, it doesn't mean that they must be large in size, but they must be very small, allowing the exchange of these respiratory gases. Our best example is for human being, we have the lungs. Now, following the lungs, inside we have the very small cells known as alveoli. These are the specialized parts of the lungs which perform gaseous exchange. Actually, for human being or for mammals, we can say the respiratory surface is lungs. But actually, gaseous exchange takes place in the alveolus. So, why there is the need of having alveolus? Why there is the need of having alveolus? Alveolus, they are very important, very, very, very important, because the lungs themselves, they are very large in size, but they have been subdivided into very small divisions, and the smallest one, they are known as alveoli. Alveoli, being small inside, they have large surface area to volume ratio, so that to ensure sufficient amount of oxygen is taken from atmosphere into the blood for circulation, and it is easier for the carbon dioxide to diffuse from the blood into the lungs for the expiration. Then after there, it must be kept moist to allow efficient diffusion, since oxygen and the carbon dioxide, they diffuse in solution. So oxygen and the carbon dioxide, they always diffuse in solution. The respiratory surface must be moist to allow the efficient diffusion of these respiratory gases. Then after that, it should possess a good blood supply in those organisms which use blood. Here in those organisms which use blood as the transport medium. This is not for all living organisms. For we human beings and most mammals, they use blood as the transport medium. So for we living organisms, we use blood as the transport medium. It should possess a good blood supply system. A living organism should possess a good blood supply system and respiratory surfaces. For example, in the lungs, we have many capillaries, the blood vessels, the veins, the pulmonary artery. It has been subdivided into very small capillaries which tend to exchange the gases with our alveoli, and then the oxygen is taken from the lungs by the pulmonary vein to the heart again for pumping to all over the body. So this helps to maintain a steep diffusion gradient, that is large difference in concentration across the respiratory surface. The good blood supply of the respiratory surfaces ensure that after gaseous exchange, after oxygen have diffused from the environment into the blood, it is quickly taken from the respiratory surface to other parts of the body. And when that oxygen is quickly taken to other parts of the body, that means it builds a concentration gradient, or it builds a large difference in concentration that will enable other oxygen molecules to diffuse from the environment, passing through the alveolus into the blood streams. And then from that, it should possess a good ventilation mechanism in large animals which use lungs as the respiratory surfaces. Ventilation process is a process which involves inhalation and exhalation. There are some of the diseases which you will study in your university level, are diseases which include the diseases which include the obstacles, or diseases which include some of the mechanisms which prevent the passage of respiratory gases into the lungs. So for example, diseases such as asthma and diseases such as emphysema. There is a disease known as emphysema. Emphysema, it is associated with the blockage of the passage for the respiratory gases. The bronchioles, they become narrow, and since they are narrow, it's not easier for the gases to pass from the environment into the alveoli. Now, why is emphysema a case? In my point here, a good ventilation mechanism. In emphysema tend to interfere with the ventilation mechanism of an organism. The ability of the respiratory gases to pass from the environment into the alveoli cells for the exchange. Emphysema tend to interfere with this, and when it interferes with this ability, that means it's not easier for the respiratory surfaces to function as usual. Now from there, as we said that the respiratory gases, they exchange in the lungs by the physical process of diffusion. Diffusion is maintained by fixed law. The rate of diffusion is maintained by fixed law. Fixed law help us to know, or help us to relate the rate of diffusion depending on different factors. So fixed law provides the way of considering how maximum rate of diffusion of respiratory gases is achieved. So fixed law help us to adjust different factors which will ensure the maximum rate of exchange of gases takes place. According to this law, it states that the diffusion rate of respiratory gas through a respiratory surface is proportional to surface area of the respiratory surface, proportional to the difference in concentration of gases either side of the membrane, and inversely proportional to the thickness of the respiratory surface of the respiratory membrane. So according to this law, mathematically we can say the rate of gas exchange is direct proportional to the surface area, then is direct proportional to the concentration difference, and inversely proportional to the thickness of the membrane. That means for the faster rate of gaseous exchange through the respiratory surface, we must have a large surface area, we must have large concentration gradient, and the respiratory surface must be very thin. They must be very thin to ensure the faster diffusion of respiratory gases. That's why, considering these factors in the fixed law, they are similar to what we said in the adaptations of the I mean, they are similar to what we said in the adaptations for the respiratory surfaces. We said they must have the large surface area to volume ratio. They must have the good blood supply system for the removal of the respiratory gases and to build a high concentration gradient. And then we said they must be very thin for the faster diffusion of respiratory gases. Now, what we can say is that organisms acquire their oxygen either directly from the atmosphere or from oxygen dissolved in water. Some of the organisms, such as we human beings and most animals which are terrestrial, they use oxygen from atmosphere. But the aquatic organisms, they use oxygen from water. Now, there are marked differences in oxygen content of air and water. A given volume of air contains 4 more oxygen, that is 21% by volume of air, than an equal volume of water, 0.8% by volume. So you can compare the percentage of oxygen in air and percentage of oxygen in water. Air contains 21% of oxygen by volume, while water contains 0.8% by volume of oxygen, 0.1% of oxygen by volume. So that means an organism which will acquire oxygen from water should have a good mechanism for extracting this oxygen from water, because it is in very low percentage as compared to the percentage of oxygen in air. Therefore, it follows that an aquatic organism such as fish must pass a corresponding much greater volume of water over its gaseous exchange surface than an air-breathing vertebrate passing air in order to obtain sufficient oxygen for its metabolic needs. So, for a fish to maintain its metabolic need, it must pass a lot of volume, or the great volume, a vast amount of water. While for we vertebrates, we are using air. So, because air it is composed of large percent of oxygen, we just pass only small amount of air in order to attain our respiratory needs. This requires a different ventilation mechanism. This point or these paragraphs help you to understand that aquatic organisms and terrestrial organisms, we use different ventilation mechanism in order to reach or in order to acquire our respiratory needs. So in order to make sure that fish or aquatic organism they attain their respiratory needs, they must use a different ventilation mechanism. Water is almost more than 500 times denser than air and 100 times more viscous. So it has high density and it is very viscous than air. So ventilation mechanism in these two groups of living organisms, so those respiring using air and those respiring using water, it must be different. It therefore requires more energy to pass water over the respiratory surfaces. Oxygen diffuses about 100 times slower through water than through air, which means that it is harder to maintain a steep concentration gradient across the respiratory surface. It is not surprising then that fish are amenable to achieve the higher metabolic rate of animal with lungs. Kwa hiyo fishes they can't attain the higher metabolic rates as how the animals they can attain. They can't reach the higher metabolic rates. Now, let us end up here. In the coming session, I will be discussing regarding the need for the special respiratory structure and pigment. Why some animals they need special respiratory structure and pigment, while other animals they don't need that. And after that, we'll be having the discussion for the gaseous exchange in animals. We'll start a gaseous exchange in animals, and more especially or more specifically in mammals. So thank you, and later wish you nice studies. Don't forget to share this session with your fellow Ugandan students. This is special for the Ugandan students. I know most of Tanzanian students, they don't prefer a teacher who use English all the time he teaching. So this is specifically for Uganda students, and I hope you will enjoy the session and you will enjoy all the things which we'll be discussing with you. Don't forget to tell your student, to your fellows, to join my Telegram group, Dr.Mlelwa, students special for Uganda students, and the link will be in the description below. I hope every one of you will enjoy the discussion and all the things which I will be providing to you. Thank you, and later wish you nice studies. Let's meet in the coming session.